Hey there, Bear Club! At the Mama Bear Initiative, we explore how to protect ourselves so we can protect our cubs, the people who depend on us. Join us and get the confidence you need to stay safe, make good choices, and protect yourself and those you care about. Let's go!
Thank you for joining us today on the Mama Bear Initiative podcast. My name is Stephanie Dunham. I'm here with Evelyn Mason and Rochelle Knapp. Today we're going to talk about anger. We want to ask some questions. What is anger? Why do we have anger? How do we tend to use it for bad? And how can we use it for good? We feel that having a proper understanding of emotions and why they're there and how to use them is a good thing to know, especially when it comes to things like self-protection, self-defense, etc., because our emotions can get in the way of so many things, but they can also be used as a tool for so many good things.
Right.
So we're going to start with the first question. What is anger? Now, you mean everybody feels it? Probably every day.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So I think everybody's familiar with the feeling itself, but what is anger? Anybody want to jump in and sort of define for our audience what anger is?
Well, you had mentioned about it being an emotion. I think it goes into the category of what is called a negative emotion, so it can feel very intense, not necessarily pleasurable.
True.
Just a sort of intense antagonism towards something or someone that you feel has done you wrong.
Yeah. It's an emotional reaction is not just a thought we have in our head. It's like a physiological reaction to something.
Yeah.
We often feel heat in our bodies, like there's a rush of blood to our body. Sometimes our heart rate will go up.
Yeah.
Sometimes our respirations will increase because we're feeling something has happened, and our body is responding to it. And we don't always know right off the top of our heads what's going on. We just know we're having a reaction to something.
Right.
Yeah, for myself, I often misperceived anger as something else. And the emotions, the physiological emotions and reactions can be overpowering.
What did you misperceive anger as?
Well, I used to think of it in a very negative way, so I was afraid of it, and I would try to how do I put this? Subdue it, because I was overwhelmed by the feelings of the physiological responses of anger. So I would just try to push it aside, and then it became unidentifiable for me. I would feel something happening in my body, but it wasn't very strong because it had been subdued for so long that I didn't actually know what it was.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of our emotions are reactions to something happening to us.
Right. And I think, off of what Rochelle was saying, the idea of anger being bad. So the idea of good emotion versus bad emotion could cause, like you, Rochelle, to try to subdue it or push it down, crush it. No, that's not acceptable.
Yeah, and I think that, anger's been categorized as, quote, bad because of the way people tend to use it.
Right.
Right.
So part of what we want to talk about today is how can we use anger for good? It's not necessarily a bad emotion.
Right.
It really, really depends on what you do with it.
Yes,
Right.
for sure.
Another aspect of what anger is this sense of injustice. Like, most of the time, and I'm speaking from personal experience,
Right.
most of the time, if I'm angry about something, it's because I perceived an injustice from someone.
Right.
And, could be my husband was in a bad mood and said something kind of negative to me. Or it could be, I don't know, somebody took the last cookie and didn't ask anybody else if they wanted it. It could be, somebody actually being rude or abusive in some way
Yeah.
towards me. So it's generally based around a perception of injustice.
Right.
And I feel like what people perceive as injustices can be real or it can be imagined.
Right.
That's true.
And it seems to be based on various codes.
Right.
Have you guys ever experienced like being angry about something and then finding out later that your perception that caused your anger wasn't based in reality?
Definitely.
Yeah. Quite a bit, actually.
Yeah. All too frequently, I'll hear somebody say something. The way they worded it might have reminded me of the way someone who had hurt me said the exact same phrase. I get unreasonably angry. And then the person's like, well, I just said this. And I go, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. When, Kathy
Yeah.
in second grade said that same thing to me. It was just before she pushed me to the ground. So,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think if I'm kind of on edge about something pretty much all the time, and then somebody does something that kind of pokes that, it can cause that reaction, that
Right.
angry reaction, even if what they were doing was not even remotely, like, wrong.
Right.
I guess. And I have to sort of like think about why did I react like that?
yeah, like, where did that come from?
Maybe apologize if I got, a little bit tart with that person about whatever it was they were doing or saying.
Right.
But, the real injustices are the ones that need anger. They are connected. And they
Yeah.
have to be connected. So let's talk for a minute about injustices. What are they? Like what is it? What is justice? First of all, let's just define that.
Justice is a sense of, a sense of right and wrong, and it's based in what we believe as a person, and that escalates into familial, societal, and cultural senses of morality. So, justice can be breaking the law and going before the judge to get a judgment because you've broken the law. That's serving justice. Or in
Right.
the sense of morality or something we see or experience, if someone does something harmful to us or hurtful, and that feeling of anger is a reaction of the injustice to us that was done to us. Or if we see someone else being hurt and they're innocent, that's a sense of justice is what anger comes from.
So it sounds like what you're talking about is people crossing boundaries.
Right.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right.
Sounds like, people set up boundaries. I think there's like concentric rings of boundaries within this world. So there's your personal boundaries.
Right.
Then there's familial boundaries. Then there's cultural boundaries. And then there's societal boundaries.
Right.
Right.
So, for example, what we were talking about when we were preparing for this earlier was this idea that, people shouldn't murder other people is kind of a societal boundary.
Yeah.
Right.
Like if we didn't have that kind of a code, and this is a moral code, if we didn't have that kind of code, then people would just be doing whatever they want,
Right.
whenever they wanted, for whatever reason they wanted to do it, right? So we have to set up these boundaries with other people so that there's a limit to what people can do.
Right.
And how we treat one another is really what this
Right.
comes down to. So, can Can you guys think of examples and the differences between societal, cultural, familial, and personal moral codes that you might have?
One example for myself for a personal moral code is I don't smoke or drink any sort of drug, any drug in any sort of form other than privy. I don't abuse them, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And that's based out of a history of a relative who was an addict. And my experience with that, I see what it, and I've experienced since I was very young what that does to people, but also personally with my mother being an addict. And I think a lot of people's moral codes are based on their experiences as a child.
Yeah.
Because that's when things are really foundational. We're really learning about, even though people tell us things, we learn that they believe are morally good. We tend to take the ones we see the most as opposed to the ones we hear. At least in my experience.
Right.
Would you say that smoking cigarettes is morally wrong in a societal sense?
In a moral sense, society has deemed it as wrong, even though it's legal. There's all sorts of discouragement about smoking cigarettes these days. Can't smoke in most public places. There's all kinds of commercials against it. All kinds of information about how bad it is for you out there. Programs to help people quit smoking. So I think as a society, we've deemed it as morally wrong. Because it's so damaging to your health. And it's an addiction as well.
That's interesting because I wouldn't have thought of smoking cigarettes as morally objectionable. I would think of it as like culturally.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, because I know, like, in Europe, there are certain countries where it's like everybody's smoking. And so societal, if you're thinking about, the whole human race, I don't know. I think it's more cultural than societal. Maybe in our society, in the United States, I think we get a mixed message. On the one hand, they're for sale in various places.
Right.
On the other hand, well, you can't smoke here, you can't smoke there, kind of like what you were saying, Rochelle. But I don't know about, like, morally.
Yeah. I'm not
It's
sure
more-
that it's morally wrong to smoke cigarettes. I think it's probably not good for you. I mean,
Right.
Studies have shown it's not good for you, but I don't know that I would go as far as saying it's morally objectionable. Oh boy.
Right. I just meant in terms of how society perceives it in the United States specifically now.
Okay.
Yeah, just to
It's more
clarify.
like, yeah, it's our society. Or like the American culture.
Right.
Yeah.
But the other side of the coin is that people who are addicted to it and do it regularly don't see it as morally wrong. So like you said, there's definitely a mixed message out there about it, because it's not legally wrong and it's done pretty much everywhere. But, society has deemed it as, some people in society have deemed it as morally wrong,
Yeah.
and they're against it.
I think a clearer example might be alcohol.
Yeah.
And alcohol's everywhere. Every
That's true.
culture has figured out a way to ferment something
It's true.
or distill something into
Right.
something that gives you a
Euphoric
release
feeling.
from your
Yeah.
stress.
Yeah, I mean, even, as early as Noah, after they got off the ark and he planted a vineyard and got drunk. So
Yeah.
it's been around for thousands of years.
Literally.
Right. So, societally, as if we want to just encompass the whole world,
Right.
there are basically alcohol's okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
not morally wrong.
Right.
Yeah, there's
Right.
liquor stores everywhere. Yeah.
Right. Culturally, though, it would seem there are different levels of acceptable inebriation.
Right.
Like, how much alcohol can you drink in a day?
Right.
When does it become an addiction,
Right.
for example? Like, some Americans are like, oh my gosh, they let teenagers drink alcohol in Europe
Right.
at a much younger age than we allow it here in the United States. And so as an American looking at, because we think of alcohol as dangerous in a lot of ways and it's not good for people and young impressionable people shouldn't be drinking it. However, the Europeans see it pretty differently. And I don't know exactly what they do and how they manage it, but we can say that different cultures over time have created their own set of rules
Right.
about what is acceptable, what the boundaries are on
Right.
how much you can drink, what you can drink, when you can drink it, so that we know when someone has gone beyond the boundary. For example, public intoxication. I've seen a couple of police cam videos recently where
Mhm.
people were acting out in public because they were inebriated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the police were called and they were arrested and taken to jail.
Mm-hmm.
And at least one of the charges was public intoxication,
Right.
right? So there's a boundary there. Like,
Right.
you can only have so much alcohol outside of your home before you start to create a problem for other people,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
right? And so, in a sense, the law of the land is seeking justice for the public against whoever it is that's creating a nuisance or problems for other people because they've had too much to drink.
Right.
Right.
And all the way to dangerous, like,
Mm-hmm.
driving while drunk, that
Right.
sort of thing.
Right. So if we kind of bring this back around to, anger, for example, anger is an emotional reaction to an injustice perceived justice, real or imagined. And injustices are based on various societal, cultural, familial, and personal moral codes that we have set up
Mm-hmm.
to give us boundaries
Right.
to operate within. And if we go outside those boundaries, then we tend to run into trouble depending on who we're with or where we're at or what sort of culture we're in.
Right.
I know that just from personal experience with training in a Japanese martial art, for example, the moral code for that is you don't really show your emotions externally. Whatever it is you're feeling in the moment, you tend to keep that inside,
Right.
Right.
right? Which is sort of a societal, cultural thing in Japan
Mm-hmm.
based on a lot of different things. I think the simplest explanation is they tend to have a, what's the word I'm looking for? A pluralistic society
Mm-hmm.
where you think as a group, you do as a group.
Yeah.
In America, we tend to be individualistic, which is why you see more people in America more, verbally expressing their feelings outwardly.
Yeah.
So if I was to compare, a feeling of injustice, I would compare different ways that people act emotionally
Mm-hmm.
out in public versus how they react emotionally in the privacy of their home or with the people that they know. Because it really does come down to what you believe is right or wrong based on various things that you've grown up with or developed for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is a good point to move on to the second question, which is, why do we have anger? Like, I'm a Christian woman, so I believe that God has created emotions within us, which means that they're there for a purpose.
Right.
That anger is not just a random evil thing that just happens to be a part of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that anger is a bad emotion.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
I don't
true.
believe it's a negative emotion. I think it's just an emotion that we
Right.
have, but it has a purpose,
Right.
right? And all emotions have a purpose, right? And something I've discovered for myself as I've been in trauma recovery is the purpose of anger. What is it? Why is it there? And how do I use it for good? Which is all the questions that we've come up with today.
Right.
Right.
Which we're going to cover all of them today.
Because I will tell you that the moment that anger against everything that was ever done to me as a child awakened, it was intense.
Mm-hmm.
It needed to go somewhere.
Right.
And I didn't act out on it, but I definitely felt it. Like I struggled with, what do I do with this? Thankfully, I was mature enough by that point that I could think through it instead of just becoming destructive,
Right.
which is what I think, why anger has gotten such a bad rap.
Right, because of how it's been misused. Yeah, mishandled.
Yeah. So the question is, why do we have anger? What's its purpose in our lives? Anybody want to talk about that?
One of the first things I thought of was it's like an internal alert system. So, when something sparks anger, it's almost like sirens are going off. There's a flashing red light. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention.
Yeah, kind of like the DEFCON system in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like going from one thing to the next.
Yeah. Like I was saying earlier, because had such a misconception of what anger actually was and what I was feeling, I spent a long time in my young adult life trying to understand that. And now it's become easier to understand why I feel angry about something I'm seeing. And I can react in a healthy way, whereas before it depended on what era I was in my 20s, I would just get super rageful. It'd go from this sort of simmering anger to rage. And then in my 30s, it was really non-existent. Became extremely passive. And now I can recognize it and use it for something good as opposed to just going into a rage or being violent. Even if I'm not outwardly being violent, I used to inwardly rage about things, which I think is unhealthy. Well, it is unhealthy. And it's not a good way to handle it. Letting it out in a healthy way, using it as fuel, or you could even call it passion, because it's as powerful of an emotion as passion is. And I think you can turn anger into passion. A lot of people have done that with things that they've done to help societies less fortunate, or people who have been hurt, unjustifiably hurt in some way, or abused. So
Yeah, so in that sense, it's kind of like a motivation.
right.
It can go into passion and then motivate to do something good, to right or wrong,
Right.
that sort of thing.
So anger used in a mature fashion is a way for us to know there's been an injustice,
Right.
whether
Yes.
it's to ourselves or to someone else.
Yeah.
I know that sometimes when I'm scrolling around on YouTube, I come across videos where an animal has been neglected and it's been starving and it's super skinny, and it just
Yeah.
it just sparked something in me. Like, how can you treat this poor thing that has no control over anything like this? How can you do that to this poor animal?
Yeah.
Right.
And, if I was to encounter that in real life, I have a couple of choices. Like, I can rage at the person,
Right.
or I can take an action.
Mm-hmm.
I could maybe rescue the animal. I can maybe on a regular basis donate money to animal shelters, or I could volunteer,
Right.
right, to help with these situations.
Right. And it all began with this isn't right.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you could take it then to a good place.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like what we're saying is not only is anger an alert system telling us something's not right, there's an injustice going on,
Right.
but it's also an energy to seek justice. Like,
Right.
because you feel anger physically,
Mhm.
right? And it's like an energy in your body,
Yeah.
and it needs to go somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's also, it doesn't feel good.
Right.
Right.
It feels like I need to do something about this. I need to change this because I can't keep feeling this.
Right. Right. So the energy needs to go somewhere, and the mature way is to seek justice.
Mm.
So the final piece to why do we even have anger I think, is taking action.
Yes.
We kind of talked about it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So taking action can look like so many different things. For example, for my personal life, learning self-defense, learning a martial art is a way for me to take action against the injustices from my childhood. Teaching self-defense is another way for me to take action against the injustices. I can turn the energy into something good.
Right.
So I think it's important to be self-aware in the moments that you're feeling anger enough to really think through, why am I angry?
Mm-hmm.
And what can I do about it? To even determine whether or not there is an actual injustice
Right.
before you do anything.
Right.
'Cause
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
easy. It's so easy to yell, scream, hit things, etc. That's an easy way to handle it.
Right.
Thank you for joining us on our podcast today. If you'd like to support our work, you can find us on Patreon. We have 2 membership levels that you can join and receive the benefits of being a Patreon. Our podcast is on Google, Spotify, and Apple. And now back to the show. So we are talking about anger. We've covered so far what is anger, why do we have anger, and now we're going to move to how people tend to use it for bad, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we all have examples of those.
Yeah, we've kind of talked about it a little bit
Yeah.
here and there, because I think the negative way that anger is used is what makes it, quote, a bad emotion or a negative emotion.
Right.
Why people tend to categorize it, why people are afraid of it. Because they're, I'm sure every child has experienced their parent raging at them, for example,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Or somebody out in public, like, just yelling
Mm-hmm.
at someone.
Right.
And I think that those behaviors, because that we talked about that energy, like
Right.
you feel it physically and you want to do something with it.
Right.
And more often than not, it tends to come out in people just like completely losing control.
Right.
Losing control of themselves, losing control of their reactions, losing control of what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Have you guys ever experienced either someone losing control with you or you losing control with someone else?
Many
Both of the above, yes.
many times. Yes.
Well, I have one for sure. I had a situation where I was talking to someone on the phone and I was trying to work with them to solve a problem. It was a problem that both of us needed to address. And instead of the person working with me, he started to blame me for the problem, and then he started to basically scream at me. And when you're on the receiving end of that, it's like being verbally stabbed, to be blunt. And it was intense and it was horrible.
Mm-hmm.
And for the first time in almost 30 years of knowing this person, I hung up on them, and I was like, it was just physically, mentally, emotionally, it was just devastating.
Yeah, being on the receiving end of somebody losing control, being rageful, for example, is frightening. It alerts, it activates your fight or flight,
Mm-hmm.
freeze fawn within yourself,
Yeah,
usually.
Right. I had an incident several months ago at work where someone came in and wanted cigarettes, and we have to ID everybody to sell them tobacco and nicotine products. And he just became very quickly unreasonably angry. And it didn't matter what I said or my lead said or my manager said. He was determined to be angry. And it was frightening, because those are the types of people you wonder what they might do if they had the opportunity.
Right.
Because they're not taking no for an answer, and they're not backing down. And I have this expectation that most people will be reasonable and will back down at some point, and this person was not doing that. And that's scary. That kind of anger, misplaced rage and anger, is scary over something that's seemingly so minor.
Yeah.
Right.
You know,
You can
that's the kind of thing that people lose control like that. You just don't know what to do because you're like, I'm out of answers. You know?
Right.
Yeah. Plus, you don't know, like you were saying, you don't know what the person's going to do. I mean, how many horrible crimes have been committed? There's something called crimes of passion. It's generally anger, and then
Mhm.
they'll act out violently.
Right.
Right. Yeah, the idea that the reason why people get really scared of angry people is because if they have no self-control, they tend to lash out verbally, physically.
Right.
Sometimes it ends in death.
Mm-hmm.
And that, is really scary to people
Yeah.
who don't know what to do when faced with someone just completely losing control of themselves.
Right.
I think, a lot of anger that's expressed is unjustifiable. It's, unjustifiable violence, rage,
Mm-hmm.
even taking revenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, again, it's based on perceived injustices.
Right.
Right. And just taken too far.
Right. And I think that, taking anger in its place is a good tool, but taken too far, it results in violence and destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like the difference between a fire in a fireplace and a fire, engulfing a couch in a living room.
Right. Yeah.
Good example. Yeah.
Yeah, because the fireplace fire is controlled.
Yeah,
It's-
and good comes from it.
Right. It provides heat and warmth, etc. But yeah, a couch on fire in the middle of your living room is going to destroy your house.
Yeah, it needs
Or
to be
you.
put out.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I have also experienced rage from other people, but I've also raged at other people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Before I had any real understanding of anger, what it is, what it's for. I could be pretty volatile.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's like one of my personality traits is kind of being on a hair trigger when it comes to perceived injustices.
Yeah.
And, just being willing to just do whatever, say whatever feels good to me to release that energy towards
Mhm.
another person, because my ultimate goal is to hurt them
Right.
Right.
in some way,
You hurt me, I want to hurt you back, kind
Right.
of thing.
which is basically taking revenge
Yeah.
through rage.
Yeah.
Now, I've never gotten physically violent with people, at least not to my knowledge. Rochelle, you and I may have had some fisticuffs when we were teenagers, but I don't really remember.
I don't know that we ever went to violence, but we definitely had some pretty bad fights.
Yeah, we definitely had some verbal
Yeah.
altercations. That was so long ago, I don't even remember what it was about, but I've had to learn to have more self-control in this way, because I've learned that my perceived injustices aren't really always injustices.
Right.
Right.
That the anger and the violence that I feel towards someone isn't always justified.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think what makes it hard with these situations is in the moment it can feel good to lash out.
Right.
And even though that's not the right thing to do, it's like just for a moment, I got it out,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But then there's the aftermath. And that's, I think, where we know, okay, that wasn't appropriate.
Right.
Yeah.
Because look at how I've hurt the people around me, or it was out of balance with what happened.
Right. And that, justice is often talked about in terms of scales,
Mm-hmm.
balancing the scales.
Right.
Yeah.
Like an action taken that's a crime, for example, tips the scales into the injustice side of things.
Mm-hmm.
So applying justice to it means bringing the scale back to balance.
Right.
Yeah, kind of like the whole idea of the punishment fits the crime.
Right. And in the case of anger, when it's unjustified and when it's just out of control, we're tipping the scales in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
We're actually
Right.
we perceive an injustice, but then we're also creating an injustice
Right.
Right. It's just,
for not only ourselves, but for other people.
it's like
Right.
perpetuating a bad situation.
And from a physiological standpoint, it feels like the anger gets more intense when you're doing something wrong with it.
Right.
Can cause you physical problems. You can have heart issues and all types of things if you keep giving in to your anger in that way. It can actually affect you in a harmful way physically.
Right.
Yeah, there's that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what we're trying to do today is to talk about anger, acknowledge there is a dark side,
Right.
Right.
and it's used so frequently that it's just become this horrible thing to people. We want to kind of tip the scales back in the other direction
Right.
to acknowledge that anger can be used for good, right? Because ultimately, if we go back to the original,
Mm-hmm.
definition, it's meant to be used to seek justice, to tip the scales back
Mm-hmm.
to a balanced point of view, right? So we can use it for bad, but we can also use it for good,
Yes.
right? We can use anger in the right and correct way.
Yes.
The Bible says, "To not in your anger do not sin," right?
Mm-hmm.
Which means to me, you can feel anger,
Mm-hmm.
but what you do with it is what matters.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's where it comes out of being neutral into positive or negative.
Right. Right. So, how can we use it for good? We've talked about seeking justice, but there are other ways. Let's just park on that for a second. What is seeking justice for something? We kind of touched on it a little bit. Like if you see something that bothers you, you can donate money, you can join a group, you can do all sorts of things. You can
Mhm.
teach martial arts, you can train in martial arts.
Right.
What are other ways that we can seek justice for something?
I think the idea is kind of like restoring things to the way they need to be for the person to be healthy, for the person to have a good life.
Mm-hmm.
So I think about, like, in the justice system, for example, the whole idea of if someone had lost a bunch of money, restoring that to that person.
Right.
So bringing things back to, tipping the scales and things are healthy again.
Right. Another one is setting boundaries with someone.
Right.
If you've been wronged by someone else, you then can set a boundary with that person.
Yeah. So, in that example I gave of that person telling me off, I told them, we're not going to talk like this again. If you start to get angry and verbally abusive, I'm going to hang up on you. Or if we're in person, I'm going to walk away.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, following through.
Right.
Right.
What are some other ways that we can use anger for good?
I think internally, when we feel the feeling of anger, and if it's something that's ongoing from a past trauma, and it's creating problems for you personally, trying to do healthier things like taking care of yourself, doing some sort of physical activity, being mindful of how you're processing your anger, because it may be something in the past you have no control over, that you can't change or make better now, but you still feel the anger, so you have to figure out a way to use that for good instead of just turning it inward and creating more problems for yourself.
So you're talking about problem solving.
Right. Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
there's this thing going on in my life and it's causing me anger and I want to make it better or I want to right a wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to find solutions.
Right. And there again, because you don't want to perpetuate that negative, it's using that energy to say, okay, how can I address this in a good, healthy way? What are some steps I need to take?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's good for problem solving.
Mm-hmm. I think one final piece of how can we use it for good is protecting others and yourself.
Yes.
I'm
Yeah,
thinking more
definitely.
in terms of like self-defense or martial arts training.
Mm-hmm.
The caveat being that you have to have training
Right.
Right.
and you need to have a moral code that dictates when you use that.
Yes.
You can't just randomly decide to take revenge on someone, even if what they're doing is actually wrong, simply because you feel it's wrong. You have to have something that gives you pause,
Mm-hmm.
but also, gives you parameters to work in so that you can stop what's going on, but also just not go straight to destruction, death, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You
How
know,
can? Yeah. Absolutely.
You basically can't be a vigilante
right.
because you would be creating another problem of injustice, especially if you're committing crimes. There's this weird, it's this weird sort of paradigm of I'm protecting someone, but I'm also creating problems for other people.
Right.
And I'm creating problems for myself. I could be caught. I could be thrown in jail or prison for what I'm doing. There's a weird, skewed sense of justice, I think, that with no sort of moral code to keep you from doing that, no boundaries, it could become a bad thing.
I want to take a little sideways trip, bringing this back around to perceived injustices based on societal, cultural, familial, and personal moral codes.
Mm-hmm.
Because right now, as we are well aware, there's a lot of disagreement on what's right and what's wrong in lots of different areas.
Right.
Yeah.
People disagree on a lot of different things. And some people just complain about it, but
Mhm.
a lot of people get really angry
Right.
about the things that they think are wrong that other people are doing, and the other people that are doing the things they think are wrong think that they're right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? And this is a disagreement on what the moral code should be in a
That's true.
cultural sense. And to some degree in a societal sense, because we're talking about the entirety of the United States.
Yeah.
So I think something that's worth considering is if your specific moral code is beneficial to society at large.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Like, what are the results of of actions you could take if you're seeking justice, for example?
Right.
Yeah.
What are the benefits of that particular action to society
Right.
at large? Maybe to the group you're in, but also to the society that you're in.
Yeah.
Like, is it actually good to do this thing?
Right. To actually take the time, think it through.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I feel like, I don't know, I'm not going to name any particular groups because I don't want to get political or into any sort of social justice modes here.
Right.
But I think there are particular groups in the United States right now who have a sense of anger, a sense of injustice, who are seeking to right wrongs that maybe take it a little too far.
Yeah.
And if they are taking it too far, what makes it too far?
Right. I remember in an ethics class that I had in college, one of the ways that we were encouraged to determine whether or not a system was healthy was to take it all the way to its extreme. Would I want everyone to live like this? And if not, why not? And if so, why?
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
to really think would this just benefit me, but would hurt others?
Mm-hmm.
And to really, determine from that perspective.
That's an interesting way to think about it. Like, what is the logical conclusion if I take this action?
Right. And if I were to take it all the way to the end, what
Mhm.
would happen?
Right.
Right, which is, I think, a good and constructive way to use critical thinking skills to decide what action you're going to take.
Yeah.
My personal injustices have gotten me to a place where I'm taking action by helping women to defend themselves.
Right.
Mhm.
That's a logical way,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a good way, I believe,
Yeah.
to seek justice for the things that I experienced as a
Right.
child. Because I can't go back in time and take revenge on the people who hurt me.
Right.
So even if you could go back and take revenge, would that be the right thing?
Right, which legally, no.
Right.
That would not be the right thing. Depending on what the form of revenge is that I'm taking.
Right.
I mean, I've seen different I've read different stories, and I've seen different TV shows and movies where characters take revenge in ways that are destructive to the person they're taking revenge on, but also destructive to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I think that's really where the key is to not create more destruction.
Right.
We want to create, I think anger can construct.
Right. How can I put this into a good place? Like you were saying, Steph, about helping women. I know with my experience with that person who was telling me off and everything, was I finally found my voice to speak up and say, no, this is wrong and you're not going to treat me like this anymore.
Right.
And then taking that same idea into helping women there again, and others who have been silenced for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
You need to find your voice too, not to, cuss somebody out, but to set a healthy boundary and say this far and no further.
I'd even go as far as saying that this podcast we're doing right now is us using anger for good.
Yes,
Yeah, I
good
agree.
point. Yeah, that's what motivated us to even talk about this topic to begin with.
Something else I just thought of is it's difficult to use anger in the right ways at times because it's much slower than what people want to do who don't have a moral code. For instance, if someone's being abused by someone else, the abuser, someone who is seeing this, might want to physically hurt the abuser, but that would create a problem for them. They would be being more violent towards somebody who's being violent, even if they are protecting the person who's innocent, instead of going through the justice system, having them arrested and going to trial. That's the correct way to do it, but it takes a lot longer. And I think for some people that can be frustrating. They want to see justice, but it's not necessarily going to go how you want it to go, because we're talking about what would be the most harmful thing or what would harm other people, as opposed to doing it the right way with a moral code, following the laws of the land and doing the right thing, instead
Right.
of just going yourself and hurting someone or killing them.
So yeah, going through a healthy and good process,
Right.
as opposed to just trying to, impulsively.
Yeah.
Right.
Address it.
Impulsiveness is, I think what you're talking about is instant gratification versus eventual gratification.
Right.
Right. And that whole idea of letting it play out, what would happen if
Mm-hmm.
I just did it impulsively, or what would happen if I let it go through a good and healthy process.
Yeah. So I guess what we could say is we're encouraging people, if you feel anger, to slow down.
Right.
Yes.
Take a breath. Think about why you're angry. Realize that it's not a bad thing,
Right.
necessarily, depending on what it is you're angry about. Then think through, what can you do about the situation that you're feeling anger about, if anything?
Right.
And then, if you've come up with a solution, follow through on it. Use the energy and the passion that's coming from the anger to make a change. That doesn't necessarily mean attacking people or raging at people. What it means is that you're putting your time and your effort into doing something constructive.
Yeah.
Something that builds something else, that doesn't tear something else down necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Putting a stop to injustices can look destructive and like you're tearing something down, but that should take time. It shouldn't be, like blowing something up, metaphorically, blowing something up for the sake of your own sense of justice. It's being mature enough to realize that, there are processes.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to deconstruct something, that should be done carefully.
Right.
Right.
Right? It should be done with maturity, and it should be done with a sense of reconstructing in
Right.
mind,
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
even changing the construction of something to where it's more useful.
Right.
Yeah. And that whole idea of construction, because what you want in the end is something that was better than
Right.
what was there before.
Yeah. So I think we're probably at the logical conclusion.
I would agree.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
think you're right.
So We'd like to thank you for joining us today as we've discussed anger, what it is, why we have it, how it can be used for bad, and ultimately how we can use it for good. We hope you've enjoyed yourself today and look forward to seeing you next time.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks so much for joining us as we discussed such an important topic. We hope you got some food for thought and encouragement to keep going and keep growing. See you later, Bear Club.
Remember to join the Bear Club on our Patreon page for exclusive content. The link is in the description. You can find our podcast on Google, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.